The day's wrap of top business stories. Power Business.
Power Business with Kaya Sitole, Monday to Thursday, 6 to 8 p.m. and Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m.
Welcome back to the Monday evening edition of Power Business. After 7 p.m., we'll be speaking about Eskom and their latest tariff application that obviously didn't find favor with the National Energy Regulator, NERSA, and what happens next. It's obviously a story that matters to all of us because, as we now know, petrol prices are going up, for example, so it's going to be a very difficult few months ahead. And if we can keep our electricity price increases capped at some level, that is something to be welcomed. Speaking of that risk profile that we have to manage as individuals, there's always obviously the big question of how businesses manage their risks, and we are now joined on the line by someone who understands these things much better than I do. Zweli Gebicala is the Managing Director of Ntiyiso Business Consulting. Good evening, Zweli.
Good evening, Kaya. Thank you so much for having me on.
Now, Zweli, one of these days you are going to be putting together a roundtable that is of critical importance to everybody who wants to understand risk and how risks are managed and, of course, how they evolve. Talk us through the roundtables that you've got lined up.
Great, and that's quite imminent, Kaya. Actually, in 2 days' time, on the 20th of October, we have a roundtable around exactly this, how do organizations, both public and private, manage risk. This is part of a broader sort of approach on our side to share knowledge with industry on a monthly basis. So each month we're hosting a roundtable. The first one being the one on risk this month. In November, we're actually hosting one on supply chain management, which also ties in quite nicely with what you were talking about earlier. And then in December, we'll have one that I'm quite excited about on data and analytics. Right. So I think back to this one on Wednesday, this one really will focus on risk and how mature South African organizations are in terms of risk.
Yeah. Now, Zweli, talk us through the key dimensions of what you look at when you're trying to sort of establish or assess a company or an organization's risk profile.
Indeed. So the first thing we need to look at is how that company is thinking about its risk culture and leadership. So does the company even worry about risk in its day-to-day meetings, in its day-to-day decision-making, etc.? And that's something that's quite important because, of course, if risk management is not within your culture or within one's culture, managing that risk becomes, quite difficult. We also look at things like whether risk management is integrated with strategy. So it's one thing, and we see it a lot where, organizations have a risk strategy or a risk management function that's very divorced from the day-to-day sort of objectives of the organization. And in fact, in a number of places where we've worked, we've seen the risk department being seen almost as the most hated compliance department, if you will.
It's
right?
the grudge department. They exist because the law says we must have them rather than us valuing them.
No, exactly. And the question we ask, and the question we'll be asking on Wednesday, is actually how do we integrate risk with strategy, with performance management, and with daily operations, right? Risk is no longer, and I think previous sort of events have shown us that risk can no longer be that thing that you sort of put in the corner somewhere and wait for every quarter to read the risk report, right? It needs to be part of daily operations right now, because actually how do you respond to an event like COVID or an event like, the KZN sort of looting that we saw previously? While there was an operational issue, there was also a risk issue, and sort of, some organizations were found wanting once those events happened.
Now, when you do talk about how to sort of crystallize the whole risk management and the risk assessment, you guys use a particular index which seems to capitalize and crystallize all of these issues. Tell us how you compile that index.
Indeed. So our partner here is called ABMI, also stands for the Attribute-Based Risk Maturity Index. Have put together quite a cool tool that's online that allows organizations to go on and sort of self-assess in terms of their risk maturity. There are around sort of 170 different risk attributes that the tool tests for to try and understand where each organization scales on each point. At this point, they've had over 250 organizations from across the continent sort of self-assess them, be it sort of the risk managers within those organizations or indeed through sort of assessments that they've done themselves. And what that presents us is a very rich data set around how organizations across a number of industries, both in the public and private sector, are thinking about risk, and how they weigh themselves around risk. And I think an interesting output here is that actually when we looked at this data, we see that organizations, both public and private, rate something like performance integration as one of the lowest areas of risk maturity that they have. So basically they're saying that, risk is not integrated to our KPIs. And so we have sort of, our organizations going ahead making decisions without having to take risk into consideration when they think about performance. That's quite an interesting insight coming out of that index.
Zweli, I imagine any company that doesn't take risk or its risk profile as seriously as it needs to is a company that's probably riding on thin ice and will probably see one of those risks materializing in the near future. How do you get them to become more sensitive to the idea that you may not like it, but unfortunately your business needs it?
So I think, previous events right now have sort of proved the need for robust and proactive risk management, right? No one could have predicted, COVID. No one could have predicted the sort of political unrest that we saw in KZN. And who knows what else can be predicted going forward. And so I think, one has to talk about how do you begin to anticipate not the risk itself, because we don't have a crystal ball, but rather the impact that it might have. So the question you begin to ask is, what would you do if all your employees could suddenly not come to work or were not able to come to work the next day, right? And that's what this maturity index begins to ask. And so part of, getting this conversation going is indeed the roundtable that we're having on Wednesday, where we'll have a number of risk managers from across the country in a digital roundtable talking about what are the key areas one needs to look at risk and how does one begin to be more proactive when it comes to risk management. I think the key message, of course, and I'll repeat it, being that risk can no longer be, that topic you engage with in that quarterly board report on risk. It's a daily reality right now, and it needs to be treated as such.
Now, Zweli, one of the interesting things that you just mentioned is that it will be a digital roundtable. I imagine the question of the digital risks and the risks associated with being forced to automate so many functions, particularly in the past 12 to 18 months, is one that even the most conservative of all risk managers doesn't understand to be key business risk. How important is it in the hierarchy of risk tools and risk management tools, the question of the digital risk and the digital evolution that we've all been forced to undertake in one form or another in the past 12 to 18 months?
I mean, it's become extremely important, right? I think probably every other company in South Africa right now is working online, but beyond that, everyone is needing to go on the cloud with one service or the other. You saw, I think it was last week or a few weeks ago, one of the big companies, Facebook, sort of going dark for a few hours. The question becomes, what happens if that were to ever happen to your company, right? Beyond sort of cybersecurity risk, there's another risk that one has to think about when it comes to digital is the risk of being disintermediated, right? There's a lot of companies that no longer exist today simply because digital alternatives have emerged to replace them entirely. And so actually digital risk comes from one not being able to comes one from cybersecurity risk, but also from the risk of simply your business model being rendered irrelevant by digital. How do you begin to think about that? And those are some of the questions that we want to be tackling.
Yeah, one of the key questions, really, is always going to be these institutions that we're saying should be a bit more refined and a bit more sophisticated in managing their risk. Do they actually know, or do they actually have access to the tools that enable them to effectively monitor and evaluate their evolving risk profiles? Or is it simply a matter of, with best intentions notwithstanding, in the absence of those tools, there's nothing that they can do actually?
Indeed. And I think, using tools is one that we see being quite important right now. I think first I would encourage and invite a lot of those people to go on to abmi.co.za to sort of play around with the risk assessment tools there. But it becomes very important, Kaya, to try and automate risk management as much as possible. And actually, one of the things we'll be discussing on Wednesday are the available technologies for actually automating risk management. Because to the point I made earlier, right, what's important now is to have risk management being a very proactive, daily operational endeavor and not something that you sort of say for the end of the month or the end of the quarter. And of course, that can't be done manually. You can't do it on Excel anymore. That's no longer enough. You actually need, sort of warning bells going off every time certain risk metrics are being breached. And so technology becomes quite important in managing risk at this point.
A very key important thing. Now, I suppose all different sectors may be reflecting different levels of the ability to understand or perhaps even the maturity in terms of risk. Are there any that are doing well and others that probably need a lot more work from the analysis that you've done?
No, indeed. So we saw in the analysis we've done, and again, a lot of this is based on self-reporting, but with some testing and some sort of, auditing on our side, right, and on ABM side rather, and we saw that sectors such as banking, telecoms, etc., tended to do quite well and tended to be quite mature in their assessments, and this is no surprise, right? Those industries tend to have larger companies with large armies of risk managers. Right. But we saw that, for example, in the sort of local government sector, in the NPO sector, in the public sector, in sort of government, in FMCG, that actually maturity tended to be quite low. And again, that really speaks to how dynamic risk is in those industries and why there's a need to actually try and improve that maturity going forward.
Very key, and I suppose maybe there are strong correlations between what you see as companies doing well or sectors doing well and their ability to marshal sufficient resources. I imagine the banks will probably do much better than NPOs, for example.
No, indeed, and that's why technology becomes important, right? So in the past, risk management and indeed a lot of management tended to rely on large armies of employees going around, sampling risks, managing that risk. But now we're saying that technology is going to come in and level the playing field a lot, and it becomes important to explore those technologies and leverage them, even for the smaller, less resourced industries.
Now, Zweli, how can Ntiyiso Consulting help some of those businesses that are listening to this conversation and say, actually, we think we've got a few more steps to cover, a few more gaps to address in our risk management exercise?
Now, thank you for that question, Kai. Indeed, I think the first step, and this is why we've partnered with ABMI on our side, the first thing we typically do and we've done for a lot of clients is really to try and get in on day one and understand that each organization's maturity when it comes to risk. Not always give a great picture of where companies and organizations need to focus, right? And what we then do is take them on a journey, and it can be as long as or short as what the assessments indicate, right? To try and set up the systems and tools and organization and operations to actually manage risk effectively. The big point here is to really make the case for change for risk management, right? To show why it is important. And where we come in as well as Ntiyiso is then integrating the risk management function to strategy and operations and making sure that, risk is not an afterthought, but actually an integral part of how, companies operate. For example, if you think about an organization that delivers projects, let's say it delivers construction projects as a matter of its daily operations, then the question becomes, project risk then becomes quite an important one to think about as they begin to build or bid for those bids. How do you then integrate risk into, let's say, your bidding process, your pricing? Becomes quite an important thing to have, quite an important conversation to have as an organization. And as we sort of come in and we help drive those kinds of organizations, where we try and integrate further the risk team with the rest of the organization and the rest of the organization's strategy.
Zweli, if people want to tap in and listen to the roundtable, is it an open event? If so, how can they get access to it?
It's completely open, Kaya. We welcome people to go register, and it's going to be quite a mouthful, but quite easy to remember. Go to ntiyisoconsulting.co.za/roundtable-discussion. So roundtable, one word, then -discussion. And then there'll be a registration form there, and we'll send you a link right after you register.
All right. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. That is Zweli Gwebichala, the Managing Director of Ntiyiso Business Consulting, giving us some unique insights into their risk maturity analysis. And of course, there is that roundtable that's coming up in a couple of days' time. If you'd like to listen in, follow the lead. As he's told you, definitely an important exercise for anyone running a business and perhaps even some individuals who want to understand how risks are managed. It's 7 p.m. Time for Power News with Bayanda Zibondi.